feed initializes with a violent flicker, the screen washing out entirely before resolving into the nauseating, grainy green of night vision. The severe fisheye lens distorts the concrete walls of the vertical shaft, making the surrounding support struts curve dizzyingly inward. A constant, high-pitched whine from the descent rig cuts through the audio. Elias's breathing is ragged, amplifying every rustle of his ballistic vest. Year 2025. Location: Negev Trench, Alpha 7. His hands, visible in the lower frame, grip the static line, the knuckles white against the dark, worn fabric of his clerical shirt tucked beneath the heavy VSP armor. The air thickens with ozone and ancient dust, smelling of burnt iron and something akin to stale sulfur. A harsh, focused beam from his headlamp cuts through the gloom, momentarily overwhelming the green tint and highlighting the condensation dripping from the ceiling. A voice, clipped and synthetic, buzzes in his earpiece. "Thorne, you are entering the buffer zone. Heart rate elevated, Padre. Maintain discipline. Remember the mandate. Observation and theological cataloging only." Elias swallows, the motion visible and sharp on the distorted camera feed. He sees the shadow of his steel cross pendant swinging wildly, catching the harsh light. He mutters a silent prayer, but the words feel thin, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the deep earth. The camera jerks violently as the platform hits the bottom of the shaft with a heavy metallic clang, sending motion blur across the screen. The entrance to the anomaly chamber yawns open ahead, not carved rock, but seamless, jet-black material, pulsing faintly. Elias unclips, the sound echoing unnaturally. He steps onto the cold floor, the heavy thud of his boots registering as solid, tangible reality in the chaos of the environment. His bodycam catches the frantic movement of two technicians in the corner, hooded figures consulting instruments whose screens flash indecipherable runes and graphs. They ignore him, their faces pale and sweating even in the chilled atmosphere. This tomb, designated Site Babel by the VSP, was unearthed 6 weeks ago by a rogue archaeological team before the Vatican intervened. It predates any known terrestrial civilization by geological eras. Elias moves slowly toward the entrance, the black material humming faintly. As he nears, the material seems to absorb his light, plunging the immediate area into deeper shadow, forcing the NVG to compensate with increased gain, creating a swirling vortex of green noise. He holds the flashlight steady, focusing on the entrance, which looks less like a door and more like a tear in reality. He reports, his voice strained. Entering primary containment corridor, ambient temperature dropping rapidly, structure feels inert, yet hostile. Confirmed presence of non-terrestrial architecture. Low, subsonic vibration starts in the air, felt more in the chest than heard. It causes the camera to shake, introducing heavy motion blur to the edges of the frame. One of the technicians suddenly screams, a strangled, wordless sound of pure terror pointing down the corridor. Elias pivots, the sudden movement causing the camera perspective to whip around, transforming the screen into a momentary smear of green static before stabilizing on a thin, almost invisible shimmer stretching across the far end of the corridor, the containment field. Elias advances toward the containment field, his movement cautious, one hand resting on the smooth black surface for balance, the other gripping his flashlight tight enough to bruise. The subsonic hum intensifies, making the audio pop and distort. The field, usually a solid blue barrier, is now flickering erratically, arcs of purple energy occasionally spitting against the metal casing surrounding the corridor exit. The technician's scream still rings in the audio feed, a testament to the palpable terror infecting the site. Elias kneels momentarily to examine a point where the alien architecture meets the terrestrial containment frame. He runs his gloved finger over the black material. It feels cold, frictionless, yet oddly warm internally. He pulls his cross pendant out, pressing the cold steel to the structure. Nothing happens, but the action is instinctive, a desperate claim of divine dominion over the inherently blasphemous. He looks up. Through the flickering containment shimmer, the primary chamber is visible. It is vast, illuminated by an inexplicable internal light source that is neither electrical nor chemical, bathing the space in a cold, blue-white glow. And in the absolute center, held inert and suspended by unknown forces, is the subject. Elias breathes in sharply, the sound loud and wet. He forgets the procedural mandate, the terror, the cold. He is seeing the impossibility laid bare. Control, he rasps. Visual contact established. The geometry. It's wrong. The containment field momentarily stabilizes, snapping back to a solid, humming blue, offering Elias a clear, horrifying view of the entity. The focus automatically locks onto the Xenolithe. The harsh white beam of Elias's flashlight sweeps over the creature, momentarily blinding the camera with reflection off its structure. When the light settles, the sheer biological impossibility of the being fills the frame. It is suspended vertically, but its posture suggests not flotation, but an unnatural, rigid stasis. The skin, wet and luminous, catches the light like quartz. The reflective quality of its immense black eyes is the most immediately shocking feature. They are mirrors, reflecting the containment chamber and the tiny, terrified human watching it. There is no warmth, no depth, only cold, empty reflection. Elias unconsciously stumbles back a half step, the motion causing a heavy dose of motion blur to wash over the NVG image. His mind, trained in centuries of theology and historical iconography, scrambles for categorization. Demon, angel, seraph. But it is none of those. It is simply physics asserting its cruelty. He sees the faint blue veins beneath the translucent patches of skin, confirming its biological nature. Yet it possesses a symmetry and perfection that screams manufactured, or perhaps divinely engineered, but by a God utterly indifferent to human form. The silent, sutured mouth is perhaps the most eloquent feature, signifying a life form that has either transcended or never needed speech. The Xenolithe remains immobile, yet Elias feels scrutinized, judged, and dismissed simultaneously. The camera's internal microphone begins picking up a low-frequency click track, erratic and alien, which does not match the facility's hum. It is coming from the creature. Elias raises his right hand, the steel cross pendant shaking violently as the low-frequency clicks intensify. He needs anchor, definition, and weaponization of his faith. He opens his mouth, intending to recite the exorcism against Satan and the apostate angels, the traditional blessing against the profane. Begins, his voice strained and high. The moment the holy words leave his lips, the containment field explodes in a flash of purple energy, blinding the camera feed. For 5 seconds, the screen is nothing but pure white light and static hash. When the view returns, the NVG green tint has been replaced by a violently flickering infrared red, the entity now standing on the floor of the chamber. It had not moved fluidly. The transition was instantaneous, a phase shift. The air temperature registers a sudden spike. The silent clicks transform into a rhythmic pulse that seems to synchronize with Elias's own racing heart, confirming the alien's awareness. The crisis hits not because the creature is demonic, but because it is not. It is entirely, terrifyingly natural and utterly outside the scope of creation myth. The infrared feed is stark and unforgiving, highlighting the sharp, cold edges of the Xenolithe's form. Its eyes, still perfectly reflective, fixate directly on the bodycam lens and, by extension, on Elias. The rhythmic pulse intensifies until it feels like physical blows against the membrane of his skull. No sound is emitted, but Elias recoils as if struck. He understands with terrifying certainty that this being is communicating, not through sound waves or telepathy, but through sheer, crushing proximity and cognitive dominance. The truth floods his consciousness. There is no soul, no purpose, no higher design in the universe, only vast silent structures of biology and physics that run independently of human hope. The Xenolithe embodies the cosmos's perfect, sterile indifference. Elias stares at its perfectly sutured mouth, realizing that this creature has never known the human concepts of prayer, sin, or salvation. It simply is. His faith, the unshakable foundation of 40 years, shatters, not against a dark enemy, but against the light of pure, objective, biological reality. He drops the flashlight, the light beam spinning wildly on the floor, casting harsh, streaking shadows and blinding flares across the feed. His hand automatically claws at the cross around his neck, not seeking solace, but attempting to tear the useless symbol away. He screams, but the sound is thin, lost and swallowed by the rhythmic, silent pulse. The intercom crackles back to life, the synthetic voice overridden by panic. "Thorne! Retreat! Now!" Elias is frozen, trapped between the crushing valence of the Xenolithe's communication and the external alarm. His body is paralyzed by the sudden, radical void where God used to reside. He sees movement behind the alien. The chamber walls themselves begin to shift, the smooth black material contracting and expanding as if breathing. Suddenly, a gloved hand belonging to one of the technicians who screamed grabs the back of Elias's vest, pulling him violently backward. The camera swings away from the entity, the entire frame collapsing into a violent, sickening smear of green and red motion blur as he is dragged rapidly down the corridor. He struggles not against his rescuer, but against the loss of the creature's presence, the horrible truth it represented. Over the cacophony of alarms and running footsteps, Elias lets out a primal, despairing shriek. His last clear visual is a snapshot taken right before they round the corner. The Xenolithe, standing motionless in the blue-white light, its head slightly cocked, watching the small, fragile human figures flee into the darkness. The metallic shriek of the emergency shutters slamming down cuts the visual connection with finality, plunging the screen into total darkness save for the persistent, high-frequency digital noise. The air in the subterranean containment bay was dead, cold, and smelled of ozone and powdered limestone. Elias adjusted the straps of his VSP ballistic vest, the effort visible as a severe motion blur across the fisheye lens. His helmet cam bathed the scene in sickly NVG green. The Xenolithe remained perfectly rigid behind the triple-layered polysteel glass, its quartz skin catching the harsh beam of Elias's flashlight, scattering it into spectral streaks. Thorne thumbed the comms unit mounted near his throat mic. Kessel, I'm secured in containment sector Alpha 9. Environment stable. But I need a definitive structural assessment on the integrity of the sealant around the primary barrier. The atmosphere in here is leaching sound. He forced himself to walk a slow perimeter, his heavy boots echoing faintly on the newly poured concrete overlaying the impossible, ancient rock floor. The massive structure was designed not to keep the Xenolithe in, but to keep the external world out of its localized gravity well, or so the initial reports hypothesized. Thorne's mind raced, searching for scriptural parallels, the golem, the Nephilim, even the Watchers. But the Xenolithe defied every category. It was biomechanical, without mechanics, life without respiration, symmetry without beauty, 5 feet tall, silent, alien, and utterly, profoundly real. He felt the cold steel of his cross pendant press against his chest, a relic that suddenly felt like a heavy, useless piece of oxidized metal. Elias returned to the viewing point, pressing his gloved hand against the chill of the observation glass. He leaned closer, studying the Xenolithe's physiology, which the VSP brief designated Homo sapiens exilium, man of exile. Its skin, smooth and wet-looking, like polished quartz, was almost reflective, yet intermittently translucent. Through these patches, Elias could clearly trace the faint blue network of internal vessels, pulsing with a liquid that seemed too viscous, too slow. It was a biological function running at an impossible rate of metabolic deceleration. The Xenolithe's posture was unnatural. The shoulders were held too high, the back too straight, creating a silhouette that seemed carved from dark ice. Its head was hairless, features minimal, a sealed, thin suture replacing the mouth and a non-existent nose. Only the eyes dominated. Vast, entirely reflective, black orbs set impossibly wide apart, staring into a space that Elias could not perceive. He tried to rationalize it as a deep-sea creature or perhaps a terrestrial adaptation to extreme pressure, but the architecture of its form whispered of deep space, of dimensions incompatible with the physical laws of his universe. He lifted his hand instinctively, tracing the sign of the cross in the cold air, a reflex action that felt hollow. It was a prayer offered to a God who, in the presence of this entity, might not be the God he thought he was. The psychological pressure of the containment zone began to manifest as a low, throbbing headache behind Elias's eyes. He adjusted the gain on his helmet microphone, attempting to counter the strange acoustic void. Testing mic level. 1, 2, 3. The words were thin, brittle. He realized that this sector wasn't just shielded. It was fundamentally mute. Any sound generated felt immediately absorbed, killed by the proximity of the entity. Desperate for grounding, Elias reached for the source of his strength, the liturgy. The words of St. John, the cornerstone of his faith, tasted like dust. As he spoke the divine declaration of creation, the Xenolithe's perfect, rigid stillness experienced its first-minute interruption. It wasn't a breath or a shift in weight, but a near imperceptible rotation of its massive black eyes. They rotated not to look at Elias, but to encompass the source of the sound, a slow, inhuman acknowledgement that sent a spike of pure dread down his spine. This thing had heard the word of God, and its only response was a silent, geometric reorientation. Elias needed a reaction, a baseline confirmation that the Xenolithe obeyed physical optics. He unclipped his military-grade flashlight, increasing the output to maximum intensity, a blinding 1,000-lumen blast designed to disorient. He aimed it directly into the entity's left eye. The moment the light hit the reflective black surface, something fundamentally wrong occurred. There was no glare, no reflection that bounced back to Elias's lens. Instead, the beam was swallowed. The entire mass of light, that violent energy, vanished into the depth of the eye. More unsettlingly, the surrounding atmosphere seemed to momentarily darken, as if the Xenolithe had locally increased the gravity or density of the air to consume the photons. The blue internal veins visible through its quartz skin seemed to pulse faster, a faint internal aurora briefly visible, fueled by the stolen energy. Elias retracted the beam instantly, breathing hard, the motion blurring the camera feed severely. This wasn't biology as he knew it. This wasn't adaptation. This was a violation of conservation laws, a living, breathing black hole contained by glass and concrete. He staggered back 2 steps, the concrete floor suddenly feeling unstable beneath his heavy boots, the weight of his faith collapsing under the weight of this impossible light absorption. Retreating to the edge of the containment room, Elias leaned against a steel strut, supporting the ventilation systems, focusing on maintaining his breathing rhythm. He keyed the recording function on his bodycam, forcing the cold objectivity of the archivist to overcome the terror of the priest. Assessment. Xenolithe exhibits localized energy absorption capabilities inconsistent with terrestrial physics. Subject appears to utilize photon energy for internal processing. He looked down, shining his flashlight beam onto the perimeter of the ancient archaeological dig, where the raw, pre-Diluvian bedrock met the modern Vatican concrete. He noticed faint, intricate scarring on the natural stone surface that had been missed in the initial site photographs. Not tool marks, but glyphs, carved deep indentations that followed no known linguistic structure, terrestrial or otherwise. They were shallow, ancient, and seemed to pulse faintly under his harsh light. They weren't carved into the rock. They seemed to have been grown there, part of the lithology itself. Elias suddenly realized these markings predated humanity, predated recorded time, and they matched the subtle, geometric patterns found in the Xenolithe's musculature. This was not a capture. This was the activation of a place of worship, an altar built of impossible mathematics and fear. The Xenolithe moved. The change was so swift and smooth that the camera feed registered only a blur of movement against the gray backdrop. 5-foot frame did not shift its weight. Rather, it pivoted from the waist up with impossible silent grace. One elongated arm, ending in digits tipped with obsidian-like claws, lifted in a slow, deliberate curve. The movement felt less like a conscious action and more like a planetary alignment. It stopped, placing the very tip of its middle claw against the thick, polysteel barrier directly in front of Elias. Then, the most terrifying thing of all occurred. The thin, sealed suture that spanned the bottom of its face, its mouth, began to react. It didn't tear, nor did it open in the manner of flesh. Instead, the suture began to unzip itself, the smooth, quartz skin retracting slightly along a perfect, invisible seam. It was opening not to breathe, not to speak, but to emanate. No sound emerged, but Elias felt a crushing pressure in his sinuses, a silent wave of negation that slammed into his mind, instantly drowning out every dogma, every prayer, and every comforting lie he had ever told himself about the nature of creation. The camera captured the widening gap, a purely geometric, horrifying, silent scream. The movement was too slow to register as motion blur, yet too absolute to ignore. The fisheye lens warps the containment vault, stretching the concrete walls as I recoil. My head jerks back, pulling the body camera's view away from the glass. I slam my back against the cold, damp concrete of the access corridor. Stop, Elias. I force myself to point the shaky military flashlight back toward the creature, the beam cutting a harsh, oscillating cone through the pervasive green tint of the NVG mode. The Xenolithe had not moved its feet. It stood as rigidly as before. But the featureless suture that sealed its face, the thin, perfect line of cartilage, had subtly shifted. It wasn't open, not in the traditional sense, but the suture was now asymmetrical, bent, a profound, horrifying violation of its original symmetrical perfection. It looked less like a sealed mouth and more like a line of tension, stretched taut over immense internal pressure, and the silence of the action was the true terror. No scrape, no rustle, no shift of air, of just a biological impossibility unfolding without sound, a silent scream etched onto the smooth, wet quartz skin. My breath hitches in my throat, a ragged sound amplified painfully by the quiet of the underground space. I fumble the recording device mounted on my wrist, confirming the timestamp. It was captured. I have the proof. But proof of what? That God's physical laws are negotiable? That absolute silence can accompany absolute transformation? I try to voice a prayer, starting with the invocation of the Trinity, but the words catch, dry and brittle. They feel hollow, utterly ineffective in this damp, pressurized tomb. The heavy VSP ballistic vest suddenly feels like an unbearable weight, designed to stop kinetic energy, useless against ontological horror. I slide down the wall, trying to maintain the line of sight, but needing a moment to stabilize the camera feed. The Xenolithe holds its new posture. 5-foot frame seems to lean imperceptibly forward, its entirely reflective black eyes, too wide apart for human geometry, now fixed entirely on the spot where I just stood. The camera captures the obsidian claws, glinting faintly under the harsh light, suggesting a readiness I hadn't perceived before. The air thickens, or perhaps the acoustics shift. I realize that the low, infrastructural hum I had relied upon, the background white noise of the containment systems, the distant thrum of the ventilation, has abruptly ceased in my immediate vicinity. It wasn't deafening. It was total, localized auditory deprivation. I can hear the frantic rush of blood in my own ears, the wet sound of my own blinking, but nothing external. It is the silence of a vacuum applied surgically to the space between me and the creature. I push the steel cross pendant, cool and solid, hard against the throat patch of the ballistic vest, a physical act of defiance against this sensory violation. The moment I touch the cross, the silence breaks with a high-pitched, almost ultrasonic whine that lasts barely a second. A sound artifact or a warning. The visual feed suffers a brief, chaotic motion blur as I flinch, momentarily losing focus on the Xenolithe, which remains impeccably still in its gaunt, alien rigidity. Theological categorization fails me. A demon possesses. It corrupts existing vessels. This being is corruption made manifest in a perfectly designed, impossibly clean, biological shell. I whisper a phrase into the camera microphone, forced through clenched teeth. VSP log. Designation Alpha Zeta. Entity exhibiting localized sensory negation field, likely kinetic dampening or acoustic absorption. Not a biological weapon, Father. I feel a desperate need to find a precedent in the Apocrypha, in the lesser-known texts of cosmic horror addressed by early church fathers. But there is no mention of quartz skin or reflective black eyes that reflect nothing but the viewer's fear. The translucent patches on its arms revealing those faint blue internal veins seemed to pulse slightly, a subtle rhythm that is utterly alien and yet perfectly coordinated. The crisis of faith is no longer about if God exists, but if God's jurisdiction extends past the boundary of the containment field. Morbid curiosity, the professional mandate of the archivist, overrides self-preservation. I slowly rise, pushing off the cold wall, my legs shaky. I inch back towards the thick observation glass. I need to understand the function of that silent, shifting suture. I raise the flashlight again, aiming the narrow, powerful beam directly into the Xenolithe's face. The reflective eyes absorb the light instantly, turning the beam into a focused black hole of perception. But as I adjust the angle, the extreme wide-angle distortion of the bodycam captures a flicker of something inside the eyes, not a reflection of the vault, but a distorted, ephemeral light source that seems to emanate from an impossible depth, contradicting the external light absorption. It is spectral, purple, gone in a heartbeat. I lean closer, my breath fogging the glass near the camera lens, desperate to confirm the visual anomaly. The Xenolithe makes no sound, no move, but the sheer presence radiates palpable, intelligent observation. Then, the second voluntary movement, slow, deliberate, and entirely focused. The Xenolithe lifts its right arm, the movement fluid but inhumanly precise, defying the rigidity of its overall posture. The hand, tipped with those terrifying, elongated obsidian claws, extends towards the glass. It stops perhaps a foot away from the reinforced barrier. As the hand pauses, I observe a severe visual distortion in the air immediately surrounding the digits. It is not heat haze. It's a localized warping of the light, like looking through poor glass or a ripple of water. The containment field registers a minute spike, a barely perceptible red flash on the distant secondary monitor screen, which the camera catches in the periphery of its wide view. It is testing the barrier, but not with force. It is testing the very space around the barrier. The site forces a silent gasp, captured only by the internal microphone, picking up the rattle in my chest. The distinction between biology and physics dissolves completely. The pressure in the containment bay had dropped to a palpable, sickening silence. Fit frame, draped in wet, quartz-like skin, centered in a rapidly expanding sphere of sensory nothingness. Elias Thorne, his VSP ballistic vest feeling like lead, and his worn black clerical shirt soaked in cold sweat, pushed his military-grade flashlight forward. The harsh beam, usually cutting through the dark with lethal clarity, now appeared to warp as it hit the perimeter of the Xenolithe's influence. The light did not reflect. It simply died, the photons seemingly absorbing into the air itself within a meter of the alien. The helmet-mounted body camera struggled to compensate. The severe fisheye lens captured the flashlight beam, bending like molten glass, its edges dissolving into the persistent, sickly NVG green tint. The auditory feed recorded only static, a sound far more terrifying than any scream, the pure, functional absence of sound waves. Elias could feel the vibrations of his own heart, a violent, meaningless drumming against his ribs, but the physics of the room had fundamentally changed. He knew he was breathing, yet he heard no intake of air, only the hollow, dead pressure against his eardrums. Motion blur followed his every small tremor as he tried to stabilize his stance against this existential vacuum, realizing the creature wasn't just silent, it was silencing the world around it. Panic, usually a physical response, manifested as a profound coldness in Elias's mind. Physical tools had failed. He instinctively reverted to his spiritual arsenal. He raised his left hand, clutching the ancient, pitted steel cross pendant fiercely, the cold metal digging into his palm. He needed sound, a recognizable anchor, proof that his world still adhered to the laws God had established. He opened his sealed lips and began to whisper the litany of supplication, the words of the church militant against darkness. Ab insidiis diaboli, libera nos, Domine, from the snares of the devil. Deliver us, O Lord. He felt the vibration in his larynx, the movement of his tongue, the strain of his vocal cords. But there was no resulting sound. The alien stood, utterly rigid, its featureless, sutured mouth sealed, its skin shimmering faintly under the distorted NVG light, the faint blue veins beneath the translucent patches barely visible. Elias screamed internally, pressing harder, forcing air from his lungs until his face flushed dark red under the camera's harsh focus. The Xenolithe's wide, reflective black eyes, set too far apart, remained locked on his futile attempt, mirroring the green filter of the bodycam back at the camera like twin, cold, emerald discs. The silence mocked him. The power of the word was predicated on its sound, its transmission. Here, the word died, suffocated by physics controlled by something alien. The Xenolithe's head tilted infinitesimally, a movement that felt seismic in the oppressive stillness. Its gaze intensified, focusing directly on the camera lens attached to Elias's helmet. This was not observation, it was intrusion. Suddenly, the highly sensitive NVG feed overloaded. The intense green tint vanished momentarily, replaced by a blinding, stark white flash, forcing Elias to instinctively flinch and raise a gauntleted arm across his face. When the NVG recovered, the green rushed back in, but the entity's presence was magnified. 5-foot frame, yet Elias felt a crushing weight descend upon his consciousness, a non-auditory voice that bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating directly against the sensitive tissues of his brain. It was not a language, but a pure geometric thought, complex, cold, and utterly blasphemous in its perfection. The intensity of the sensory overload caused a wave of motion blur across the screen as Elias's body involuntarily shuddered, the cross pendant swinging violently against his ballistic vest. He was being probed, analyzed, categorized not as a man, but as a vessel of failed theology. The Xenolithe began to subtly manipulate local reality. Its smooth, wet quartz skin suddenly started behaving like an impossible mirror. Instead of reflecting the harsh, distorted image of Elias and the containment room wall, patches of its torso and limbs began reflecting angles that did not exist. Elias saw brief, terrifying glimpses of non-Euclidean geometry shimmering on the entity's chest, impossible intersections of light and shadow, edges that curved inward upon themselves, and forms that defied 3 dimensions. It was visual noise that spoke of fundamental instability. The blue internal veins, faintly visible beneath the translucent skin, seemed to pulse with this chaotic reflection. Elias stumbled back half a step, the motion blur amplifying the sense of disequilibrium. His faith, which anchored him to a structured, ordered universe, ruled by a creator, buckled under the visible proof of spatial corruption. The ancient steel cross felt less like a shield and more like an anachronism. He lowered the flashlight beam slightly, checking the floor. The concrete was solid, yet the light falling near the entity seemed to skip, suggesting points where matter momentarily ceased to interact with known physics. Overwhelmed by the spatial paradoxes, Elias decided retreat was necessary to reset his mind. He turned slightly, aiming for the invisible perimeter line where sound and light suppression ceased. He intended a rapid, controlled egress, but the environment around the Xenolithe resisted. As he tried to take a step, he felt an enormous, crushing resistance, as if he were trying to wade through liquid iron. The motion blur on the camera intensified, registering the agonizing, slow pace of his movement. He was exerting massive physical effort, his wiry build straining against the invisible force field. The Xenolithe was anchoring the localized laws of physics to itself, effectively creating a gravitational sinkhole focused solely on Elias. He managed to drag his boot across the floor, the heavy ballistic vest digging into his shoulders, but his foot was immediately drawn back, sliding against the concrete toward the unmoving, rigid entity. He was being pulled back into the null zone, a prisoner of modified inertia. He fought against the pull, his dark stubble glistening with sweat, letting out a silent, futile grunt of effort, captured only as a violent vibration on the camera's internal microphone feedback. Elias stopped fighting the physical resistance. It was exhausting and pointless. The Xenolithe was a master of fundamental forces, rendering his military training, his vest, and even his flashlight irrelevant. 5-foot organism. He knew the remaining battle must be fought entirely within the metaphysical realm. With a desperate surge of conviction, he unclasped the ancient steel cross from his neck, holding it out, suspended between himself and the alien. This was not a weapon to ward off a demon, but a symbol, a complete, concise representation of human theology, suffering, and divine intercession. He held the cross perfectly still, forcing the Xenolithe to acknowledge the concept it represented. The entity's rigidly perfect posture finally broke. Its long, gaunt arm, tipped with obsidian-like claws, lifted slowly. It did not reach for the cross, but rather it moved its hand to the side of its head, not touching its sealed suture of a mouth, but its temple, as if preparing to execute a massive, focused psychic projection. The NVG green tint seemed to momentarily darken, focusing all available energy on the impending teleological blast. When the Xenolithe projected its response, it was not a visual blast, nor a renewed auditory hallucination, but a momentary, chilling clarity. For one terrible second, the impossible reflections on the Xenolithe's quartz skin coalesced, overlaying the image of the cross, the symbol of ultimate sacrifice and redemption was instantly, perfectly transposed against an image of infinite, sterile void. This void was not chaotic or malevolent. It was merely empty. It was the absence of organizing principle, the lack of intentionality, the mathematical impossibility of purpose. Elias Thorne, the Vatican Section P archivist, experienced the pure intellectual cessation of the divine. The structure of the universe did not collapse, but the philosophical reason for its existence did. 5-foot biological humanoid alien with reflective black eyes was the absolute final proof that God, as he understood him, was not merely distant, but irrelevant, a conceptual placeholder for a universal mechanism that operated without consciousness. The cross fell silently from his numb fingers, hitting the floor with a soundless thud, absorbed instantly by the Xenolithe's null zone. The profound crisis of faith was complete, replaced by absolute, cold horror. The floor tiles, previously warped and slicked with an unidentifiable dampness, now dissolved entirely into a tessellation of impossible angles. 5 foot. The entity had not moved a muscle, yet its proximity was overwhelming, dominating the nauseating green view. Elias tried to anchor himself with ritual. He opened his mouth, attempting the familiar rhythm of the Gloria Patri, but the noise of his own breath was the only thing that reached his ears, quickly muffled and absorbed by the oppressive null field. His military-grade flashlight, clutched in a white-knuckled grip, became a useless rod of aluminum. Its beam, harsh and concentrated, hit the creature's smooth, wet, quartz skin and simply ceased to exist, not reflecting, not illuminating, but absorbed into a perfect, light-eating vacuum. Motion blur spiked as Elias tried to shift his weight against the increasing sense of falling upward. The creature's large, reflective black eyes, set too wide apart, were now the only true light source in the vicinity, mirroring the faint, distant green glow of the bodycam, reflecting back not a room, but a silent, infinite geometry that bent the laws of optics. He pressed the steel cross harder into his ballistic vest, searching for the spiritual solidity that should be his birthright, finding only cold, inert metal. The conceptual confrontation escalated beyond light and sound into pure data transmission. The Xenolithe, still rigidly motionless, projected a vast, invasive vision directly into the deep wiring of Elias's consciousness. He saw an infinite loop of human theological history compressed into a terrifyingly brief instant. The construction of the Great Pyramids, the Sermon on the Mount, the burning of Alexandria, the printing of the Gutenberg Bible, all reduced to frantic, ephemeral scribbles on the surface of an indifferent cosmic ocean. The vision was not accusatory, but clinically observational. The Xenolithe showed him the mechanism of faith, a complex, beautiful, and fundamentally self-referential system designed purely for local comfort and structural cohesion. The camera captured Elias's head whipping violently left and right, his dark stubble catching the NVG glare as sweat beaded on his forehead. The ambient silence was now replaced by the internal roar of catastrophic cognitive dissonance. The creature transmitted the idea: the creator you seek is merely the boundary condition that allows for local complexity. Elias felt the foundations of 25 years of seminary and service shudder and collapse under the immense, crushing weight of geological and temporal scale. Realizing his God was not universal, but profoundly, beautifully, tragically provincial. The null zone's control over space-time tightened. The edges of the corridor dissolved into what looked like deep-sea thermal vents rendered in wireframe, intersecting at non-Euclidean angles. Elias felt the familiar, sickening pressure of his inner ear trying to compensate for movement that wasn't physical. He glanced down at the cross in his hand, a dull, familiar shape of suffering and salvation. In the sudden, brutal clarity imposed by the Xenolithe, he saw it instead as a primitive schematic, a binary instruction set for organizing hope. The creature's elongated, obsidian-tipped fingers, which had remained at its sides, twitched once, a movement so subtle it was almost missed in the NVG blur. This small, involuntary motion seemed to generate an electrical shockwave of philosophical dread. The translucent patches on its wet quartz skin glowed faintly, revealing the faint blue lattice of internal veins mapping out a biological architecture predicated on silent, cold efficiency. Elias understood, with a certainty that erased decades of scripture, that the universe was not awaiting salvation, but merely calculating entropy. He tried to speak the name of Christ, his lips forming the syllables, but the concept felt hollow, an empty echo in a universe designed for pure, unadorned silence. The bodycam registered maximum motion blur as Elias involuntarily staggered forward, drawn by the creature's silent, magnetic presence. The Xenolithe pressed the final, devastating point. It projected a memory, not Elias's, but an astronomical observation stretching back beyond human comprehension. Elias witnessed the birth and death of galaxies in a fraction of a second, not as a spectacle, but as an utterly sterile, repeatable process devoid of intention, guidance, or judgment. The accompanying data stream was overwhelming. Billions of years of cosmic operations, proving that the principles of human morality, sacrifice, and divine love were local emergent properties, fragile defenses against pure chaos, but utterly meaningless on the scale the Xenolithe inhabited. Elias's stomach heaved, the physical manifestation of profound psychological trauma, though the nausea was instantly suppressed by the null field's regulatory grip on his senses. He felt the heavy ballistic vest, labeled VSP, suddenly become a suffocating weight of false protection. His mission, his vows, his entire existence as a darknet archivist seeking the truth of the divine collapsed into a horrifying punchline. The creature's sealed mouth seemed to flex slightly, an inhuman expression of pure, detached, intellectual satisfaction. The knowledge implanted was not just evidence against God, but a complete, undeniable map of universal indifference. Elias slid to his knees on the geometrically fractured floor, his flashlight beam now pointing uselessly at the ground, casting only a localized area of negated light. With the realization came a desperate, animalistic rejection. Elias, despite the crushing weight of the revelation, refused to surrender his physical being. He scrambled to his feet, gripping the ancient steel cross like a shiv, sweat stinging his wide-open eyes. The NVG tint made the crimson streak of blood where the cross had dug into his palm look like black oil. He lunged forward, a raw, inarticulate sound escaping his throat, which was immediately drowned by the surrounding silence. He drove the cross point first toward the Xenolithe's rigid form, a final, primal assertion of faith over cold logic. The Xenolithe remained immobile until the very last instant. As the steel neared its chest, the creature tilted its head, a movement that felt like the slow grinding of tectonic plates, and extended one impossibly long, obsidian-tipped finger. It did not touch the cross, but its proximity was enough. Elias felt an instantaneous, sterilizing cold flow through the metal, rendering the relic inert, stripping it of all symbolic meaning. The cross became heavy, just iron, incapable of carrying the weight of salvation. Elias fell back, stumbling over the warped geometry of the floor. The futility of his defense mechanism physically paralyzing him with shame and failure. The Xenolithe, having absorbed his highest spiritual effort, simply retracted the digit. The feed lurches violently, dominated by the nauseating, convex distortion of the fisheye lens. Elias is on his knees, dry heaving bile onto the metallic grate floor where the creature had stood. The green tint washes over the scene, emphasizing the sickly luminescence of the residual energy field, the null zone, where the data transfer occurred. His hands, caked in sweat, grip the ancient steel cross pendant. It is cold, just metal, utterly inert. There is no comfort, no residual charge, only the hollow certainty that the universe is indifferent, and the divine concept he dedicated his life to was merely a self-imposed boundary condition. The sudden absence of meaning is physically sickening, a trauma deeper than any bullet wound. He presses the cross against his forehead, not for blessing, but for the hard physical pressure, attempting to anchor himself back into the tangible world of the VSP mission, the vest, the dirt, the 2025 calendar year. The Xenolithe is perhaps 4 meters away. Its gaunt, quartz-like form momentarily paused, seeming to observe the consequences of its act. Elias doesn't look at it directly. He forces his eyes onto the heavy ballistic vest, the worn black clerical shirt beneath, trying to remember who he was 30 seconds ago. The body, however, acts on pure reptilian instinct. Get up, move, survive. The movement is clumsy, driven by muscle memory that bypasses the obliterated theological framework of his mind. Elias scrambles backward, using the edge of the corridor wall to haul himself upright. The bodycam view swings wildly, a chaotic sweep of blurred decay and green-lit industrial piping. He ignores the throbbing ache in his temples and the mental artifact left by the transfer, a constant, low-grade hum of universal silence. He is no longer fleeing a demon or a test of faith. He is fleeing a predator, a biological problem that requires a mechanical solution. The military-grade flashlight, dropped during the transfer, lies near the entrance to the deeper sector. He lunges for it, the motion a frantic burst that causes the feed to suffer brief signal dropout. Visual static. Retrieving the light, he doesn't use it to banish shadow, but simply as a tool, a heavy cylinder of aluminum. He avoids looking back at the Xenolithe. If he sees those reflective black eyes again, he fears the mechanistic action might cease entirely, leaving him paralyzed by existential horror. His breath rasps loudly in the feed's microphone, wet and shallow, punctuated by the metallic clang of his boots struggling for purchase on the damp ground. He needs distance, any corner that will break the line of sight. Elias reaches the main junction, a wide open intersection where the service tunnels meet the main subterranean transport route. The NVG environment renders the space in stark, monochromatic green relief. Massive hydraulic pipes loom, covered in thick condensation. He slaps his hand against the ballistic vest, fumbling for the comms unit strapped near his shoulder. He flips the transmit switch, hearing only the familiar, sickening hiss of static, the Xenolithe's presence, or the facility's innate interference, still nullifying radio waves. He tries to transmit anyway, a desperate, guttural sound lost to the static, a useless plea for help that he knows will never reach the surface. The realization hits him with fresh cruelty. There is no one else, no rescue, no divine intervention. The weight of the VSP gear suddenly feels immense, designed to protect a man of purpose. Now it simply encases a desperate, terrified animal. He realizes he is still wearing the cross over the vest. He reaches up and with a vicious pull rips the chain from his neck. The steel pendant clatters onto the graded walkway. The sound is sharp, loud, definitive. He doesn't pause to regret the loss. He has merely shed a useless skin. Then, the sound. It wasn't the heavy tread of boots or the scrape of claws, but something far more unsettling. A low, resonant, grinding noise that seemed to vibrate through the superstructure of the facility itself. It was the sound of the Xenolithe beginning its pursuit, not running, but flowing over the slick floor, its rigid posture maintained even in movement. Elias flinches violently, the sudden movement blurring the feet again. The creature is not rushing, which is worse. It suggests certainty, a chilling confidence that escape is futile. He spins on his heel, searching the junction walls. He spots a small, recessed steel door, marked with faded yellow warning stripes. A maintenance closet or utility room, maybe large enough to conceal him. It is not an objective of faith, but an objective of geometry. A place to hide. He moves toward it, the flashlight now clenched like a club, reflecting the harsh green of the NVG. The grinding sound increases in pitch, subtly, but unmistakably closer. He has seconds. The maintenance closet door is sealed by a heavy, archaic padlock, rust blossoming around the steel shackle. Elias doesn't bother with finesse. He doesn't pray for the lock to fail, nor does he invoke St. Jude, patron of lost causes. He lifts the heavy flashlight, an instrument originally meant for illumination, and brings its butt down on the padlock with a shocking, mechanistic violence. The first strike only dents the metal. The second strike, driven by pure adrenaline-fueled terror, shears the ancient shackle with a loud, tearing crunch. The noise feels deafening in the empty subterranean chamber. An auditory beacon for the approaching creature, the camera feed shakes with the impact, briefly showing distorted views of his contorted face, his eyes wide, reflecting only the harsh green light, his mouth fixed in a snarl. He kicks the damaged door inward, revealing a cramped, pitch-black space filled with dust-caked cables and outdated monitoring equipment. He dives inside, the ballistic vest catching momentarily on the doorframe before he shoves his way through and slams the door shut, gripping the jagged edges of the broken lock mechanism to hold it in place. Inside the closet, the air is thick with dust and the smell of ozone. Elias freezes, pressing his back flat against the cold metal shelf rack. He makes the tactical decision to turn off the flashlight. Even its harsh beam, visible through the door cracks, is too risky. The NVG green tint is now absolute, filtering the claustrophobic space into a nightmare diorama of wires and shadows. The camera is fixed on the door. He focuses all his auditory senses outward. His own breathing is painfully loud, sounding like a broken air compressor in the silence. He forces himself to breathe shallower, slowing his racing heart. Boundary condition. The alien concept loops like a broken vinyl record in his mind. He is no longer Father Elias Thorne. He is a biological anomaly, an unexpected variable in a predetermined cosmic equation, hiding from the physical manifestation of universal indifference. The psychological trauma is so severe that it manifests as a dull, constant ache behind his eyes. He is trying to process the fact that the tools of his old life, faith, compassion, ritual, are not just useless, but actively misleading, while the tools of his VSP training, rigidity, tactical awareness, violence, are the only things keeping the meat suit functioning. The grinding stops. Absolute silence descends upon the junction, a profound vacuum of sound that is infinitely worse than the noise. Then a faint, reflective silhouette appears in the thin gap between the door and the frame. The Xenolithe has reached the closet. The bodycam, fixed forward, captures the impossibly wide, entirely black, reflective eyes appearing in the crack. They do not seem to be actively looking. They merely reflect the residual green light, distorting it through the thin opening. The sheer, silent proximity is terrifying. Elias presses his spine harder against the shelving, trying to make himself smaller, trying to make his breath non-existent. 5-foot frame, perfectly rigid outside the door. There is no fumbling, no frantic searching. It simply knows where he is. The heavy boots of the VSP uniform feel enormous, clumsy. He can feel the faint, cold vibration of the creature's presence transferring through the steel floor up into his own terrified skeleton. This is not a hunt. It is a clinical identification. The pressure outside the door subtly shifts. The Xenolithe has not moved its rigid body, but Elias suddenly registers a faint, almost imperceptible change in the air pressure right outside the seal. He realizes the creature isn't relying on sound or the visual detection of the smashed lock. It's sensing his unique biological signature, the fear chemicals flooding his system, the unique odor of his panic. The creature's head, hairless and featureless, tilts minutely. The thin suture that serves as its mouth, normally sealed, twitches, a tiny, sickening pulsation that reveals internal blue veins glowing faintly just beneath the quartz skin. It's not looking for him. It is tasting the air. The realization paralyzes him with a new level of dread. He can stop making noise. He can turn off his light, but he cannot stop being meat. The creature raises one elongated hand, the obsidian-tipped claws scraping lightly, deliberately, against the steel door right next to Elias's helmet. The message is clear. The predator has found its prey, and the hunt is effectively over. The question is only what comes next. The air inside the maintenance closet was hot, stale, and smelled of ozone and industrial bleach. Elias huddled low, knees drawn up, the bulky VSP ballistic vest pressing against his ribs. The bodycam's NVG display painted the tiny space in sickly greens, the rusted shelving, the coiled yellow extension cords, the sheen of sweat on his own trembling hands. He had not prayed. The mechanism for it was inert, the circuit broken by the catastrophic clarity of the void. There was only the physical reality of the threat. The creature was outside. He knew this not through sight, the door was solid aluminum, but through a deep, subsonic resonance that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into his teeth. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical pressure, like standing too close to a jet engine that runs on malice. The fisheye lens distorted the doorframe, making the latch look warped and fragile. Elias focused on his breath, forcing it down, trying to silence the ragged intakes that sounded impossibly loud in the small space. His heart hammered a desperate, uneven rhythm against the pressure plate of the vest. He shifted the heavy military-grade flashlight. Its beam kept pointed downward, a pillar of harsh white light aimed at his own worn boots, defining the only reality that now mattered. The geometric plane of the floor and the imminent physics of his death. The steel cross pendant, once a source of infinite comfort, felt cold and inert, merely a piece of dense, useless metal hanging against the Kevlar. A faint scratching began on the exterior of the door. It was slow, methodical, the sound of quartz-like material dragging across aluminum, infinitely patient. It was not trying to smash the door. It was exploring the weak points, mapping the mechanism. The sound was too precise, too calculating, stripping away the last illusion that this was a wild animal. This was a calculating, architectural predator. Elias's body seized, a pure chemical shock of adrenaline. He lifted the steel cross, not in supplication, but analyzing its weight and density. 4 ounces of cold steel, meaningless against a creature that had nullified the entire concept of the divine, yet it was the heaviest thing he held that wasn't bolted to his body. If he survived this, he wouldn't be Father Elias anymore. He'd be a mechanism dedicated to heat exchange and mass displacement, a unit of meat attempting to prolong its function. The idea brought a strange, bitter relief. He was free of the impossible weight of doctrine. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible creak as the creature tested the integrity of the door jamb. The vibration intensified, and the air momentarily tasted metallic, an electrical precursor to violent force. The NVG feed flickered slightly with the near-field energy field. The Xenolithe emitted, a brief wave of static slicing across the emerald display. The Xenolithe's attack was utterly silent and devastatingly effective. A sudden, sharp stress fracture spiderwebbed across the aluminum panel, radiating out from where the latch met the frame. Then, the sound of tearing metal, a shriek that cut through the silence like a physical blade. A small section of the door panel peeled inward, curling like a sheet of paper. Through the aperture, the NVG green was momentarily obliterated by a slice of pure, reflecting blackness. One of the creature's reflective, inhumanly wide-set eyes appeared, studying the interior with absolute, emotionless precision. It was too close, filling the entire distorted frame. The motion blur instantly activated as Elias threw himself sideways, scrambling over the spilled contents of the closet. The eye vanished, replaced immediately by the slow, deliberate insertion of an elongated digit. The claw, obsidian black and razor sharp, scraped across the concrete floor, testing the distance. Elias screamed, not a prayer, but a raw expulsion of air, and lunged for a coil of heavy extension cord, yanking it free from the shelf. He wrapped the cord around his left arm as a rudimentary shield, knowing it would only delay the inevitable for a microsecond. The smell that followed the breach was not rot or sulfur, but the clinical, cold scent of pulverized mineral and wet stone. The geometry of the room had just collapsed. Escape now meant instantaneous, pure speed. Elias didn't wait for the Xenolithe to fully clear the doorway. He surged forward, pushing off the shelving unit, using the momentum and the brief distraction of the confined space. He lunged out of the closet and into the wider main corridor. The fisheye lens exaggerated the sudden spatial shift, making the hall feel vast and distorted. His run was ungainly due to the heavy vest, a desperate, staggering lope. He flicked the flashlight beam upwards, sweeping it across the polished concrete walls, searching for the nearest junction or point of concealment. The beam cut through the ambient NVG glow like a searchlight. Behind him, the sound of the Xenolithe extracting itself from the maintenance closet was chillingly quiet. A soft scrunch as its rigid 7.5-foot frame cleared the demolished doorway. It's hunting, not killing. Elias realized, the thought mechanistic and clear. This entity was not driven by simple hunger, but by utility, by the profound satisfaction of neutralizing potential complexity. The mental weight of God, the soul, and redemption, the things it had erased, were the prey. He was just the package. He rounded a corner, forcing his body into a hard pivot, momentarily blinded by the motion blur. He found himself facing an open loading bay area, dimly lit by emergency strobes. Elias slipped on a patch of moisture, catching himself clumsily on a stack of discarded shipping crates. The resulting impact sent a jarring ripple through the bodycam feed, sickening the visual field. He used a brief moment of cover to regain his bearings. The Xenolithe appeared at the corridor intersection, its movement a terrifying study in controlled rigidity. It didn't run, it simply covered ground with impossibly long, precise strides, its quartz skin catching the harsh emergency light, making its entire form seem to shimmer with cool, wet light. The reflective black eyes locked onto him. Elias didn't feel the psychic pressure that had shattered his mind before, but a wave of profound nausea, the physical echo of the void it had inflicted. The creature was utilizing a low-level, physical byproduct of its power now, aimed at destabilizing his physical body. Elias lifted the flashlight, aiming the concentrated beam directly into the Xenolithe's face. The reflective eyes absorbed the light completely, returning only two perfect, starless black discs. It didn't flinch. It was impervious to such primitive, material concerns. Elias scrambled further into the loading bay, noting a derelict security checkpoint booth, heavy glass, reinforced counter that offered potential cover. He knew the glass wouldn't stop the claws, but it was geometry he could exploit. Reaching the checkpoint, Elias dove behind the thick U-shaped counter, dragging a heavy, damaged monitor stand with him. He had two choices: continue running aimlessly, or try to create an obstacle that bought him time to analyze the environment. He chose the latter. He used the monitor stand to wedge the nearest access door, partially shut. Not enough to hold the Xenolithe, but enough to introduce a delay of fractions of a second. His hands worked purely by instinct, the mechanics of survival overriding all learned social behavior. He was operating at a level beneath thought, purely reflexive. Finding a large spray can labeled Emergency Contact Cleaner, he tested its nozzle. High pressure, noxious fumes. Not a weapon, but a distraction. The cross dangled, a silent observer to his purely secular battle. He gripped the can and positioned the flashlight on the counter, using the steady beam to monitor the approach. The Xenolithe was close. The glass walls of the booth vibrated violently, and the scent of pulverized stone grew overwhelming. Elias, watching the creature's silhouette through the frosted window, understood the new doctrine. There was no divine intervention, only vectors, chemical reactions, and mechanical failure. He was only Father Elias in the clothing. Inside he was hardened, purely functional meat. The glass wall to his left exploded inward without a sound. Shards scattered, catching the light in a crystalline spray, adding razor-sharp geometry to the tactical problem. The Xenolithe's arm, impossibly long and ending in those menacing obsidian claws, punched through the ruined frame. It wasn't reaching for him, but testing the range, slowly and deliberately. Elias reacted instantly, unleashing the high-pressure stream of contact cleaner directly onto the creature's smooth, quartz-like skin. The resulting cloud was instantaneous, a thick, white, noxious plume. The Xenolithe recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion, its rigid posture momentarily disrupted by the unforeseen chemical barrier. The movement was a slight, subtle jerk, But it was enough. This wasn't a biological creature impervious to physics. It was simply optimized for a reality Elias no longer comprehended. The distraction bought him 3 seconds. 3 seconds to scramble out from behind the counter. 3 seconds to realize that the creature, which could have crushed his mind or body at any point, was playing a meticulous, patient game. It wanted him to struggle, to discard his old identity piece by piece, proving the absolute superiority of its nihilistic reality. He was not being hunted. He was being educated. Elias turned and ran deeper into the complex, the empty steel cross pendant bouncing against his Kevlar, the silence of the void roaring louder than any engine of destruction. The floor of the secondary access tunnel blurred into a sickly green streak as Elias ran. The fisheye lens warped the tunnel walls, making the distance seem both infinite and impossibly compressed. Motion blur was so severe the camera struggled to refresh, capturing the scene in violent, stuttering flashes. His military-grade flashlight, swinging wildly, carved chaotic cones of white light through the dense, stale air, momentarily overriding the NVG tint. He didn't look back. He only registered the increasing resonance of vibration through the concrete floor, the soundless, unnatural gait of the Xenolithe. The weight of the ballistic vest, usually a comfort, was now an engine of exhaustion. That was the only prayer now. Not grace, not mercy, but the measurable product of mass times velocity. He had shed God like a worn-out coat in the last room. The cross swinging against his chest was just steel, a crude impact tool. He jammed his flashlight into a wall bracket, angling the harsh beam back down the narrow corridor, hoping the sudden blast of luminescence would confuse the creature's overly wide, light-sensitive eyes. This was physics versus biology, predator versus prey, nothing more. The concept felt cold, clean, and utterly liberating after 40 years of manufactured spiritual weight. Elias accelerated, ignoring the stitch in his side, focusing solely on the next 100 meters, the next structural integrity calculation. Elias reached a dead end marked by a rusted ladder leading straight up into an abandoned ventilation shaft. He scrambled onto the cold rungs, the ballistic vest, restricting his movement, the fisheye view twisting the vertical ascent into an impossible curve. As he climbed, the vibrations ceased. He paused, flashlight held steady below him, 5-foot frame. It did not climb. It stopped and tilted its sealed head, its entirely reflective black eyes meeting the camera lens. Then the terror returned, not as physical fear, but as a vast, soundless draining. It wasn't sound, and it wasn't magnetic feedback. It was the echo of a profound, cold absence, a sudden drop in the atmosphere's meaning. Elias felt his mind attempt to grasp for any shred of theological comfort, and felt the creature, through some unknown sensory organ, attempt to vacuum that nascent thought away. The creature seemed frustrated by the lack of spiritual resonance, its rigid posture wavering slightly before it turned away, perhaps realizing the well was dry. Elias continued his climb, lungs burning, the physical pain a necessary shield against the metaphysical consumption. The ventilation shaft terminated in a small service hatch, which Elias carefully pried open. He found himself overlooking a massive, tiered subterranean processing center, a silent cathedral of defunct machinery, illuminated by emergency red lighting and the deep green sweep of his NVGs. He crawled onto a narrow maintenance gantry high above the floor. Down below, the Xenolithe was moving. It walked deliberately to the center of the vast space, near what looked like a shattered marble altar, likely the epicenter of the facility's religious architecture before the crash. The creature stood motionless for several seconds, then performed an action Elias struggled to categorize physically. Its translucent skin seemed to dim slightly, and the air immediately surrounding it shimmered like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day. Except here, the surrounding pressure gauges on nearby machinery began to spin violently backward. It wasn't feeding on matter, but on the residual emotional entropy. The ghost in the machine. Elias understood. It was consuming the last lingering vestiges of the faith held by the victims who died here, sterilizing the area of spiritual residue. The horrifying implication was that this creature wasn't just physical. It was a biological mechanism designed to enforce ultimate meaninglessness. Elias lowered his body, pressing flat against the cold metal grating, watching the biological vacuum cleaner operate below. Resting against the gantry, Elias cycled through his VSP training protocols. The memory surfaced with painful clarity, overriding the panic. Dossier: Xenolithe strain 7B. The initial intel suggested their victims often displayed no physical wounds, but post-mortem brain scans showed instantaneous, massive atrophy of the frontal lobe regions associated with abstract thought, moral reasoning, and spiritual cognition. They were not seeking biomass. They were hunting the neural pathways that create belief systems. The goal wasn't death. It was nullification. Elias realized his recent conversion to brutal materialism was not a choice, but a defensive mechanism, an involuntary self-mutilation performed to deny the creature sustenance. He had instinctively made himself worthless to the Xenolithe. The VSP file had concluded with a stark warning. The only defense was absolute nihilism, or immediate overwhelming kinetic force. Elias gripped the cold steel cross pendant, feeling its weight. It wasn't a symbol anymore. It was 3 ounces of rigid steel. His gaze snapped back to the layout of the processing center. There, across the vast chamber, was a heavy, secured pressure door. Sector D access. Survival required crossing the floor, a material equation of distance, time, and potential interception. Elias began moving, traversing the upper gantry in a low crouch, relying on the NVG filters to keep him concealed in the industrial darkness. His internal clock was ticking. He calculated the fastest path down the support structures to reach the massive floor, then the 300-meter dash across the processing chamber to Sector D. He slipped down a vertical structural beam, controlled descent using friction alone. When he hit the main floor, the impact jarred his helmet-mounted camera, causing a moment of extreme motion blur and lens flare. He stabilized quickly, ready to sprint. But the creature was already there. It had not moved from the center of the room, yet it now stood directly in front of the massive Sector D pressure door, over 300 meters away from its previous location. The sheer speed was not possible according to material physics, but Elias forced a rationalization. The creature must have used ventilation ducts or unseen shafts. He rejected the possibility of teleportation or supernatural movement. The Xenolithe stood sentinel, unnaturally still, its posture rigid enough to suggest petrification, blocking the only viable escape route. The Xenolithe turned its sealed face towards Elias, its reflective black eyes fixing him instantly across the immense distance. It began to move, slowly, deliberately, its unnatural limbs scything through the air, closing the gap with terrifying mechanical precision. Elias didn't run. Running was illogical. It would waste energy and only prolong the inevitable physical confrontation. He yanked the steel cross off his neck chain, the cheap metal tearing loose. It was sharp at the edges where the smith had finished the steel centuries ago. Elias gripped it in a reverse hold, the cross acting as a crude ice pick or shiv. He charged toward the creature, bellowing a guttural, meaningless sound. A sound of pure, unadulterated animal rage. The sound wasn't a prayer or a curse. It was simply a loud, acoustic wave designed to disrupt the creature's focus. The creature paused, momentarily confused by the absence of fear or spiritual resonance in the attack. Elias closed the distance in a rush of green-tinted motion blur, lunging high and driving the sharpened tip of the cross with every ounce of his remaining strength into the Xenolithe's translucent, quartz-like shoulder joint. He felt the cross bite deep into the dense tissue. The Xenolithe emitted no sound. Its rigid posture didn't even break. It merely tilted its head down, inspecting the intrusion of the steel cross buried a half-inch deep into its anatomy. No blood poured out. Instead, the immediate area around the wound began to cloud, the translucent skin turning opaque white, like fractured ice. The creature's massive, reflective black eyes fixed not on Elias, but directly on the cross handle, clutched in his fist. Elias perceived a sudden, intense calculation, a focus on the object's symbolic weight, even though Elias himself had discarded it. The creature seemed confused by the use of an implement of historical belief as a simple piece of sharpened, aggressive matter. This momentary, philosophical processing delay was all Elias needed. With a grunt, he wrenched the cross free, leaving a small, cloudy fissure in the creature's shoulder. The Xenolithe barely registered the pain, but the attack had momentarily stunned its pursuit programming, locking it onto the concept of the weapon itself. Elias didn't bother retrieving the cross. He dropped it, letting it clatter harmlessly onto the metal floor. He sprinted past the momentarily distracted Xenolithe and slammed into the manual override console beside the massive Sector D pressure door. He hit the emergency purge button. Alarms screamed. Red lights flashed violently, overcoming the NVG green in dizzying strobes. The pressure door shuddered, beginning its painfully slow mechanical retraction cycle. The noise was deafening, drowning out any potential psychic consumption. The Xenolithe finally reacted, turning and reaching out with an obsidian-tipped claw, aiming for the back of Elias's neck. Elias dove through the gap as the door was still grinding open, the heavy steel plating scraping across his ballistic vest. He rolled violently onto the concrete floor of the other side just as the door sealed shut with a final, booming, hydraulic slam. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. The physical exhaustion, absolute. He was alive, not through divine intervention, but through friction, momentum, and the timely application of kinetic force against a distracted organism. Sector D was dark, cold, and utterly neutral. He reached up, feeling the cold metal of his vest, realizing that mechanical survival was the only faith he had left. The metal shrieks of the service crawl space amplified the ringing silence that followed the collision. Elias dragged himself forward, the steel cross having bought him 7 feet and a pulverized shoulder socket. The NVG green tint bathed the rusted duct in a toxic luminescence, the severe fisheye lens warping the tunnel into an inescapable maw. He was moving, but the movement was purely mechanical. The engine of his soul had seized. He was a VSP asset, nothing more. A wave of motion blur swept across the lens as he stumbled out of the vent into a concrete chamber, the harsh glare of his tactical flashlight slicing through the gloom. The physical act of using the cross, the ultimate symbol of redemption, as a blunt instrument against an entity that fed on its very meaning, had severed the last, thin tether to his former life. He paused, leaning against a support column covered in mildew, the ballistic vest digging painfully into his ribs. He felt nothing, no fear, no regret, no spiritual wound. That was the horror. The Xenolithe hadn't just taken his faith. It had sterilized the ground where faith once grew. Its power was not to destroy belief, but to prove its futility and non-existence. He was running from an undeniable truth encased in slick, wet quartz. Elias forced a shallow breath, the smell of ozone and decay filling his lungs. Survival protocols flooded his mind, cold and welcome. The priest was gone. Only the operative remained, and the operative had a mandate: containment or termination. He checked his internal comms display, still static. The VSP helmet HUD flickered, showing rapidly fluctuating pressure readings, indicating imminent structural failure in Sector Gamma 7. The deeper he moved into the substructure, the more unstable the environment became, which was his only advantage. He listened, not for heavy steps or scraping claws. He listened for the absence of sound that defined the Xenolithe. The creature moved with the sickening, rigid grace of something operating outside the laws of friction. It didn't stalk, it glided, leaving behind the chilling impression of pure reflection. Elias activated his light strobe briefly, illuminating a discarded maintenance trolley and walls slick with condensation. He needed to set a trap. He found 3 spent detonation caps wired to old seismic sensors, relics of the facility's construction phase. The impulse to pray for them to work was utterly absent. Instead, he calculated the yield curve and the probability of a cave-in versus the probability of merely stunning the creature. The fisheye view highlighted the urgency, pulling the corners of the chamber towards him, creating a vortex of stress. The thought of the creature's reflective black eyes, too wide apart, filled the periphery of his vision. He knew it was watching, perhaps already around the next bend, merely observing his final technical preparations, savoring the moment before it dismantled the methodology entirely. It was an archivist of nullity, and Elias was its final entry. Elias tapped the side of his helmet, bringing up the last cached VSP data packet on the Apostate Strain. The data was thin, mostly conjecture derived from historical texts detailing phenomena associated with systemic loss of communal belief. The entity manifests where ontological framework integrity is weakest, physical engagement is futile, spiritual resistance causes consumption, acceleration. The text confirmed his horrifying suspicion. He was physically alive only because the process of consuming his structure of belief required prolonged proximity. His despair was its communion. He stripped the worn clerical shirt from beneath the ballistic vest and crumpled it, throwing it into a pool of oily water. The action was purely symbolic, a physical shedding of a title that no longer held meaning, a desperate attempt to reduce his spiritual profile. The gaunt, skeletal figure of the Xenolithe flashed briefly at the edge of the fisheye lens, a motion artifact, a ghostly blur. Elias froze, gripping the flashlight handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was close. The translucence of its quartz skin, the faint blue pulsing of internal vessels. The creature was a biological system built to negate the immaterial, a walking, breathing paradox. He vaulted a low barrier of broken piping, landing hard and aggravating his shoulder. The pain was irrelevant. He entered a wider service junction, a place where 3 major conduit lines converged, the ideal place for a controlled collapse. He needed structural instability greater than the Xenolithe's capacity to instantaneously traverse it. He began rigging the seismic charges, working with the practiced efficiency of a sapper. The silence was absolute, heavier than the surrounding concrete. That silence was alien. It was the sound of a universe that had decided consciousness was a mistake. Suddenly, a faint auditory hallucination began, the sound of a choir, distant and warped, echoing a distorted Kyrie eleison. The sound was not external. It was generated by the creature, aiming for his deeply rooted memory structures. Elias jammed his fingers into his ears beneath the helmet, fighting the psychological warfare. Deny the architecture, so he muttered, recalling the VSP training for psychic countermeasures. He focused on the immediate material world, the rust, the cold steel, the chemical smell of the explosives. He looked up, and the Xenolithe was standing 60 feet down the central conduit, perfectly still. It hadn't walked or run. It had simply transitioned. The wide black eyes reflected the flashlight beam back as twin, merciless, white flares. They were utterly devoid of aggression, possessing only infinite reflective curiosity. The Xenolithe began to move, not walking, but swaying forward, its posture unnaturally rigid, its elongated obsidian-tipped digits trailing along the damp concrete wall. It wasn't rushing the kill. It was presenting itself. As it drew closer, the phantom choir intensified, morphing into a series of whispering voices that spoke fragments of liturgy, snippets of confession, echoes of his own ordination vows. This was the entity trying to pull the residual spiritual matter from his memory, attempting to coax the flavor of belief out of the dry husk of his mind. Elias braced, refusing to raise his weapon. Physical violence had merely been an irritant last time. This time, he had to starve it. He consciously cleared his mind, focusing on pure data points: charge timers, structural load, escape vector. The creature halted 5 meters away, its immense height exaggerated by the fisheye distortion. Through the translucent patches of its skin, the faint blue veins pulsed faster, indicating increased activity. It tilted its sealed head, a gesture that conveyed profound intellectual interest. It wasn't a predator. It was a librarian cataloging the final decay of a dying system. Elias stared into those entirely reflective black eyes and saw not judgment, but the terrifying confirmation of his own emptiness, a perfect, sterile reflection of the green-tinted bodycam feed. Elias armed the charges, 4 seismic units linked to his helmet timer. He didn't have time to retreat far, but he had to ensure the collapse was comprehensive. The Xenolithe extended one elongated hand, the obsidian claws catching the light, and made a silent, beckoning gesture. The gesture was agonizingly familiar, mirroring the gesture of blessing a priest makes over the Eucharist. The sheer blasphemy of the mimicry almost broke Elias's focus. He didn't flinch. He triggered the timer. 15 seconds. He turned and ran, the VSP vest heavy on his back, his breath rasping through the comms microphone. Motion blur rendered the tunnel ahead into a green smear. The Xenolithe did not pursue immediately. It stood in the converging pathways, seemingly contemplating the nature of the mechanical violence that was about to erupt, observing the final desperate rejection of structure. Elias reached a reinforced junction 50 feet down, scrambling onto a narrow ladder leading to the next level of the infrastructure. The sound of the collapse would be deafening, the pressure wave lethal. He just needed to clear the blast zone. 10 seconds. The count reached 3. Elias gripped the cold rungs, shielding his face against the expected shockwave. 2. The Xenolithe still stood at the epicenter, its head tilted, anticipating the physical annihilation. 1. The blast was not a sharp explosion, but a deep, resonating crack that tore through the concrete matrix. Dust and pulverized rock instantly choked the air, rendering the NVG useless in the whiteout. The structural collapse was massive. A tremor ran through the entire substructure, and Elias felt the sickening lurch as the main conduit lines ruptured and tons of debris began to fall where the Xenolithe had stood. He scrambled up the remaining rungs, pushing into the next access point, a smaller, cooler pipe network. He heard a grinding, scraping sound beneath the roar of falling concrete, the sound of quartz skin dragging against rock. It was not trapped. It was merely delayed. Elias pulled himself into the cramped, dark upper chamber, his body trembling, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion and the physical trauma of the blast. The body cam stabilized briefly, showing a massive wall of debris where the junction used to be. The Apostate Strain was still there, alive, and relentlessly seeking its final communion. Elias had entered the penultimate sector, the designated emergency communication bunker. He was running toward the final failure, not salvation. The air in the maintenance shaft was hot and thick, smelling of ozone and burning insulation. Elias ignored the searing pain in his hands as he scrambled down the rusted vertical ladder leading to sublevel Epsilon, the core energy grid. The helmet cam swung wildly, the NVG green washing over the crumbling concrete walls and exposed conduit, giving every movement a horrific, stuttering quality. Below, the rhythmic, heavy thrumming of the geothermal generators promised both interference and a potential grave. It doesn't want my body. It wants the structure. The thought burned through the remnants of his frontal lobe. The Xenolithe wasn't hunting a meal. It was prosecuting a database purge. The Apostate Strain was biological nihilism. It consumed the concept of meaning. If he could overload the system, physical, mental, electrical, maybe, just maybe, he could break the connection. He reached the bottom, dropping the last 6 feet with a heavy, jarring impact that elicited a strangled grunt, the sound muffled and distorted by the NVG mic. He aimed the powerful beam of the flashlight toward the ladder well above. The light caught nothing, but the residual psychic silence remained, chillingly close. A spatial distortion that suggested the Xenolithe was descending with an inhuman, deliberate slowness, savoring the final seconds of his complex, meaningful life. He found himself in a vast, echoing cavern dominated by 3 churning, high-voltage turbines, their casings radiating intense heat. Elias braced against the closest turbine housing, the vibrations running through his ballistic vest and rattling the steel cross pendant hanging beneath it. His mind was a battlefield. Every memory of theological structure, the grace of God, the historical infallibility of the Church, the purpose of suffering, was simultaneously present and utterly vacant, like watching a silent film of immense importance that carried no narrative weight. Accident, noise. He was empty now, a vessel of trauma and survival instinct, stripped of the identity that had defined 40 years of existence. This realization should have brought despair, but it brought only cold, calculating clarity. The Xenolithe consumed meaning. If he had none left to give, perhaps he became inedible. He pulled a heavy, 3-foot-long adjustable wrench from a nearby tool rack. Cold, inert steel. A much more reliable anchor point than any spiritual doctrine. He gripped it, the NVG tint making the metal shine with an eerie, sickly green sheen. The sealed suture of the Xenolithe's mouth was not for feeding. It was an interface for silence. The entrance to the cavern was now filled with the creature. It did not stalk or rush. It simply occupied the space. 5-foot frame appearing elongated and razor-thin against the distant, low-level emergency lighting. Its quartz skin reflected the turbine's humming magnetic field, creating shimmering distortions. Elias noted the large, reflective black eyes were fixed directly on his face, or rather the camera feed that recorded his face. He felt the familiar, crushing, psychological pressure intensify, not as fear, but as profound semantic decay. He tried to recall his own name, and for a terrifying second, it was merely 3 syllables of meaningless sound. He was losing the ability to define self. He hefted the wrench. If he couldn't survive spiritually, he would survive kinetically. He was a piece of meat with a heavy weapon. No higher purpose needed. He screamed, a raw animal sound disconnected from language, and charged the creature, aiming not for a fatal blow, but for the visible cluster of faint blue veins pulsating beneath the translucent skin of its chest. The collision was not messy, but unnervingly clean. Elias, powered by pure frantic muscle memory, slammed the steel wrench into the creature's sternum. There was a sickening, dry crack, the sound of dense, crystalline structure fracturing, and a brief, intense flare of internal blue light visible through the translucent patches of the Xenolithe's skin. The creature did not cry out or stagger. Instead, the psychic nullification field surrounding it spiked violently. Elias felt every remaining structure in his mind seize up. The name Vatican Section P evaporated. The memory of the VSP training manuals, the face of his commanding officer, the comforting weight of his mother's hand, all became dust. The physical impact had momentarily disrupted the creature's integrity, but in response, it had executed a final, desperate psychological counterattack, draining the last vestiges of his complex human identity. He was thrown backward, skidding across the concrete floor, his head impacting something hard, the camera view flipping and vibrating wildly. Elias lay winded, his lungs burning, looking up at the generator ceiling spinning above him. The Xenolithe was approximately 3 meters away, its posture rigid, vibrating slightly, confirming the damage inflicted by the kinetic blow. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across its upper torso. Yet its wide, reflective black eyes remained locked onto him. Studying the results, Elias reached up, his fingers brushing against the cold, ancient steel cross on his chest. It was twisted and bent from the impact against the concrete. It was no longer a symbol of redemption or sacrifice. It was a shrapnel shield, inert mass, that had provided microseconds of distraction. He had survived the physical attack, but he realized with cold finality that he had failed the spiritual defense. The erasure was complete. He had no context, no history, no faith. He was a primate in a uniform, operating on reflex. The Apostate Strain was victorious, not by killing him, but by reducing him to mere biological noise, incapable of generating meaningful, disruptive data. The Xenolithe slowly pivoted, the slight shuddering fading away as its internal mechanisms compensated for the damage. It recognized the successful completion of the purge. Elias, watching through the low-angle, distorted lens, felt no urge to move, no fear, no regret. The creature was no longer a threat because he was no longer a target. The complex structure of Father Elias Thorne, VSP Agent 749, the believer, the doubter, the priest, had been utterly dismantled. The creature took 2 steps toward a darkened maintenance tunnel. its massive frame gliding silently, abandoning the hollow shell on the floor. Elias tried to communicate, to call for help, to access basic training protocols, but the words that escaped his mouth were guttural, random sounds, noise, not language. He saw the flashlight beam resting nearby, still casting its harsh white cone. He stared at the light, unable to process its purpose or origin. The only things remaining were instinct and sensation, the dull ache in his chest, the metallic taste of blood, the rhythmic thrumming of the machines. The camera, still functioning despite the trauma, remained fixed on the scarred, vibrating ceiling of the generator room. Minutes passed, measured only by the monotonous pulse of the turbines. Elias slowly lifted his hand into the frame, flexing his fingers aimlessly, observing the action without comprehension. He was a memory slot that had been successfully wiped clean. He was alive, biologically, but the mission of the Apostate Strain was fulfilled. The green tint of the NVG feed began to degrade, streaks of purple bleeding into the edges of the image caused by internal camera failure from the impact. A final, faint, clicking sound emanated from the helmet mic, a short burst of static followed by total, complete silence. The archive feed abruptly flatlined, leaving behind only the cold, meaningless data of a consciousness that had ceased to be.